Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Brown Morales, and I'm really excited to have you guys join us today as we explore navigating menopause, specifically discussing psychedelics and women's health. We'd love for this to be an active conversation, so please feel free to use the chat to ask questions. And we'll get started in just a moment. We'll give everyone another minute or so to join. But if you wouldn't mind, we'd love to see all the places we're gathering from today. If you can drop your location in the chat, that would be awesome. Let's see. Boston, New York, Tampa, Westchester. Wow, Italy, New Jersey. Very cool. London, Turkey, Omaha, England. Amazing. Very cool. Well, that's one of the exciting things about the Beckley Retreats experience is you can kind of always anticipate many different countries and locations being represented in our programs. And in this next just minute or so here, for those that might not be familiar with Beckley Retreats, we offer comprehensive science-backed global well-being programs that are really designed to support meaningful and lasting change. So our programs are guided by, in my opinion, a world-class team of facilitators who are experts in modern approaches to well-being as well as global wisdom traditions. So we're really happy to share additional resources about our work following the webinar. But today, we're really excited to focus on this conversation ahead, navigating menopause, inner work for women. And so we can shoot over to our intro slides. Okay, well, again, I am VN Brown Morales, the COO of Beckley Retreats. I'm a former Army captain and a business and operations consultant, as well as a breathwork facilitator. And today I'm honored to be joined by Grace Bless Hopley and Helen Down. So, Grace, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Ian. Yeah, it's lovely to be here. My name's Dr. Grace Blest Hopley, and I'm a neuroscientist and a psychedelic researcher. And I've done psychedelic research on military veterans through Heroic Hearts Project. But my key aim at the moment is really as the founder of Hystelica, which is an organization really focusing on how we understand psychedelics in women's bodies. So it's great to be here.
And I'm Helen Down. I'm a freelance journalist based in the UK. I mostly write midlife experience pieces for the national newspapers over here. I'm a 52-year-old woman, so I am deep into the menopause right now. And if any of you are too, my sympathies.
Thank you, Grace and Helen. So today, this is our agenda. I'm really excited about this conversation because, like many women, I found that there are surprisingly few opportunities to engage in informed conversations about navigating menopause, despite how universal this stage of life is for us. And it's often addressed, in my opinion, in quite fragmented ways with a really narrow focus. Solely on symptoms rather than the broader physiological, neurological, and emotional shifts that really come with this transition. So today we'll be exploring a little more about that and exploring it as a complex and multidimensional transition. So we'll go through the neuroscience of menopause, lived experience, as well as some looking into some of the emerging approaches for navigating this stage with greater clarity and support. And then at the end of this session, we'll have an opportunity for more questions. So feel free to pop them in the chat as we move through these slides, and we'll try to grab some of them if they can work in, but we'll for sure answer them at the end of our presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Grace.
Thank you so much. So I think before we kick on with my presentation, I think there's a poll that is going to go around asking a few questions about menopause and what it means to you in that transition. So I think that has gone out now. There we are. So yeah, what comes to your mind when it is that you're thinking about menopause? And what is menopause itself? And I think sometimes we've always thought menopause is this sort of finite moment where, there's a before and an after. But actually, menopause really is something of a transition. And I think we don't speak enough about quite how long that transition can be. It can be between 4 to 10 years, that transition through menopause. And actually, symptoms of menopause can start turning up in people much in their mid and late 30s, even. And we understand now that conditions like ADHD, for instance, are associated with people's menopause symptoms turning up much earlier. And there really are very set stages of menopause that we go through, and they are defined, as you can see here, by shifts in our menstrual cycle. So when we're in that really early perimenopause stage, these are shifts of less than 7 days, and we start to move into late perimenopause, where we have over 60 days without having a menstrual bleed. And we say that someone is postmenopausal once it's been over 12 months since they had their last period. And what triggers this to happen is, of course, our reproductive hormones, estrogen and progesterone, start to decline in our bodies. And when we're in that transition period, as you can see from this graph, what we see is actually the hormone estrogen really fluctuating through perimenopause, which is what we can see in a lot of the symptomology that I'll come on to explain in a moment, until we reach menopause, where we have a steady state of estrogen and progesterone, but much lower than we have in our earlier lives. If we move to the next question now, please. Slide even. So, what does it mean when estrogen goes away? Well, estrogen, we're always kind of told, is just this thing that governs our reproductive health and our reproductive organs, but it really is far, far, far more than that. It really is a very powerful neurosteroid, and it's involved in a lot of processes in our brain that are highly useful for keeping our brain healthy and for keeping our cognition sharp. And some of those things include helping with neuronal loss. So we know that estrogen can help to act as an anti-inflammatory. It has high antioxidant properties for the brain, which help with cell survival. We know that it helps with cell growth and neuronal growth. So in areas like our hippocampus, for instance, which is a real key part of the brain for memory, we know that estrogen helps to keep this brain part of the brain really plastic and able to make these new connections with other neurons, which are so vital for things like memory performance. And we know that it also is incredibly powerful within our serotonergic system. Now, serotonin really is the kind of feel-good hormone within our brains. And we know that estrogen works within this system on a number of different ways to increase the amount of activation that is going on within this system. Now, these three things all combined together have a huge cognitive impact. So when we have high levels of estrogen, we know that it's associated with higher levels of executive functioning. But unfortunately, what we see in menopause, when we have reduced levels of estrogen, we actually see a cognitive impact start to happen. Next slide. Thank you. So what does that actually mean? Those are the mechanisms of how estrogen affects our brain and how in menopause we see it reducing. But what does it actually mean for us and how we feel and how we show up in the world? Well, I'm sure I'm not the first person to tell you that we have physical symptoms that are associated with menopause, things like hot flashes and night sweats and joint pain. But those are often the only things that we end up talking about when we talk about menopause. And I think a lot of that is because they're very visible symptoms. But most of the symptoms that people are most concerned about when it comes to menopause are not visible. And they do come about as a result of these changes in estrogen and progesterone in our brain. So one of them very much is mood instability. And we see that these fluctuating hormones during perimenopause can really lead to very disturbed mood. And once we reach later menopause and we have this low level of estrogen, people can feel in quite a depressed state. And this can also come about not just from how we feel, but how we're able to perform on a cognitive level. Things like memory issues, difficulty concentrating, suddenly feeling like you can't remember things in the way that you used to are really common effects of perimenopause and menopause. And these come about because of this loss of estrogen and progesterone. And furthermore, we see people reporting a lot of sleep disturbances during this time. Now, that can be for a number of issues. It can often be to do with the hot flashes that we see, the night sweats, but it can also really be to do with the effects of mood that are coming about in menopause, and particularly things like anxiety. Anxiety can be one of the biggest drivers that we have for things like insomnia. And when we talk about anxiety, it's really important that we talk about things like the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary axis. It really is our body's kind of stress response system. It's a very cyclical system within our bodies that releases things like cortisol when we wake up in the morning so that we know that we need to get up and do things. But we also know that it responds to stress. And when we see people going through perimenopause and into menopause, we can often see they get dysregulation within this system and they get stuck almost in this heightened stress response. We've got cortisol being released when it shouldn't be, which leads to us feeling very anxious and can affect things like our sleep and, of course, our mood. Now, I think we have another poll that we wanted to put up now, so I'll just pause for 1 second while we do that. And in this one, we wanted to ask people about how they get their information about menopause. One of the things that really shocks me whenever I get the opportunity to do these talks is just how little women have often been educated about the powerful effects that our hormones have on not just our reproductive system, but really on our neurological symptoms and on the way that we feel and our quality of life. So if we move on to the next slide, that would be awesome. So these are the effects that we see with things like our mood, but I really wanted to kind of highlight here how much often these can start looking like people receiving differences in diagnosis when we hit menopause. And one of the things we really see with women going through perimenopause and menopause is a huge uptick in how many of them get diagnosed with things like depression. And you can see here as we move through early perimenopause, late perimenopause, and post perimenopause, that increases to up to 40% more likely for people to be diagnosed with depression. But is it really depression that we're seeing there, or is it more of symptoms that look like depression but are far more associated with this perimenopausal and menopausal change? And I think that's why we see so many women getting diagnosed here, perhaps wrongly, without people really investigating what their hormonal health is doing, and why we see so much treatment resistance within this group when they are then diagnosed and treated with things like SSRIs that we know are, perhaps not particularly good at addressing the same symptoms as loss of hormones. There's another aspect to the consequences of going through menopause on our neurological health. And I just wanted to mention it here because we're now starting to realize that actually women have got a much higher rate of risk for things like Alzheimer's disease and dementias that occur once women have gone through these perimenopausal and menopausal changes as a result of this loss of the effect of things like progesterone and estrogen. And unfortunately, we don't have really great answers for it. Now, a lot of that is because we've never been very good at really listening to women and investigating women's bodies. But it's also because I think we need to look at how we can think of ways to replicate how things like estrogen and progesterone loss can be supported within the brain. So moving on to the next slide, please. And that's why I think we might all be here today to talk about a way that is starting to show some real promise in its ability to address a lot of the symptoms that we do see in menopause. And psychedelics seem to do that in incredibly interesting and variety of ways. Now, psychedelics like psilocybin have a primary action that works through our serotonergic system. They primarily bind to the 5-HT2A receptor, which is one of the main receptors in our serotonergic system. And so when we take a psychedelic, what we see is this increased activation within the serotonergic system that takes place during the time that we're under the influence of a psychedelic, but can also last in the weeks that come after psychedelic use. Now, in those weeks after the psychedelic use, we see this change within the serotonergic system, but we also see it on a more widespread scale within the brain. And a lot of that can come about because we see it stimulating things like BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Now, this works a little bit like a miracle grow in the brain, if you were. And back when I was talking about neuroplasticity and how estrogen can change the amount of plasticity within areas of the hippocampus, well, we see when we use psychedelics, both now within animal models and human models, that there is this change within the plasticity in our brains and how we're able to make those new connections. And another really interesting component to psychedelics is we also start to see that there is this anti-inflammatory effect that takes place. And when we take psychedelics in the sort of days and weeks after, we actually get this anti-inflammatory action. Now, that's really talking about the mechanisms and the molecules and how cells are responding to psychedelics. But there's a far, far more interesting point, and I think it's something that Helen's probably going to be able to speak of a little bit more from a personal story. But that really is what is the psychological effects of psychedelics and how they really enable this moment of being able to perhaps make emotional breakthroughs and be able to think and rethink about our the way we might conceptualize things within that moment. Now, that is particularly important with something like menopause, because with menopause, it really is a moment of transition between one sort of part of our lives into another, and psychedelics really help us to be able to integrate that change within our lives. And within all of this, within this sort of increase of activation in the serotonergic system, increased plasticity, increased neurogenesis, and these psychological insights that we get with psychedelics, we get this promotion of cognitive flexibility. We really see the sort of entropy within the brain, the parts of the brain that have been stuck within a very rigid, maladaptive pattern of thinking be broken down under the influence of a psychedelic. And with all these different factors together, we're able then, in the days and weeks and months and potentially years afterwards, to be able to move forward and start to redevelop the thought patterns that we have about ourselves and often about the world around us. Moving on to the next slide, please. So I think there is one more poll that we want to put up before we move on to this slide, where hopefully now, having explained some of the mechanism, I will be able to share a little bit of the evidence. But before we do, we want to ask what your current relationship is with psychedelics and wellness. And hopefully you can see the poll on your screens now. So it's not just me who's come up with this theory and thinks that psychedelics could be used in this way to help with menopause. And if we break menopause down really on the symptomology and what we see, we have very good evidence to show that psychedelics could work. There have been a lot of clinical trials that have gone on for a number of years now that have shown very conclusively that psychedelics like psilocybin can be used for major depression, for treatment-resistant depression, and even have been shown in comparison to SSRIs to be as efficacious, if not more, at treating these disorders. And of course, that goes beyond just things like depression. We know now that psychedelics can be used for anxiety quite successfully, post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as a number of very interesting new conditions. We're even now moving into trials that are looking at neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's, for instance, using psychedelics. Now, one of the other really interesting factors that we see in psychedelics is this regulation that seems to happen within the HPA axis. And people who have dysregulation within their HPA axis and often are having high cortisol spikes at times of the day that are not helpful after using a psychedelic, we've seen that this seems to regulate in a number of people. And so there's reason to believe that this would be the same for women within menopause. And we also see improvement in things like pain and sleep when people use psychedelics. Women suffer chronic pain far more than men. And a lot of the time, chronic pain can be not just associated with tissue damage, but it can have psychological attachments. And often that can be worsened, particularly when we see things like decline in estrogen. And yet, we've seen with psychedelics and a number of the trials that I've been running, actually in collaboration with Beckley, where we observed military veterans and we looked at their chronic pain, that actually this comes down. And a lot of that is to do with that rewiring in the brain of how we perceive things. And that can include things like pain. And furthermore, we've also seen people reporting that they have much better sleep. And that could be for a number of reasons, potentially the anxiety reasons that I mentioned before. And these are just a few of the things that have been said to me through a recent survey that I ran, asking women who'd gone through ceremonies similar to the ones that they run at Beckley, who were in perimenopause or menopause, to tell me how that experience had gone. And as you can see, it's been extremely useful for many women, and from really this not just this biological mechanism, but right through to the psychological aspects of what it means to be a woman and what it means to be going through menopause. So at that point, I will stop talking and hand over to Helen, who is going to tell you a little bit about her experience.
And Helen, I'll just pause us for just a second just to let everyone know that we are recording this session and we will send the recording out at the end after we wrap up here. So you'll be sure to have the copies of it. Okay, Helen, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you, Grace. As informative as ever, and I can never stop learning about this subject. And I have loads of questions for you myself after hearing all that. But I'll jump into my personal experience in the hope that it might help some of you. As mentioned, I'm 52. I think I started menopause about 8 years ago, aged 46, but it's really hard to identify a hard start point, which is part of the confusion around menopause, I think. I did a Beckley retreat in May 2024 in Utrecht. I was very lucky. It was Beckley's first women's only retreat. And seeing as though I was going there specifically to see if it would help with menopause, that was ideal. And spoiler alert, it did help with menopause. For me and most of the women I know, the hardest part of menopause and perimenopause, I'm going to use the two interchangeably. It's not the physical symptoms, the cliched hot flashes and brain fog. It's more the pernicious mental health symptoms that sort of sneak up on you. Sometimes I feel slightly gaslit by menopause because you don't know why you're feeling so bleak until you get a chance to step back and see it more clearly. And that's something that my Beckley experience certainly helped with. I often describe menopause as a joy zapper, and by that I mean it's just harder to find joy in the things that were once guaranteed to bring it. On my bad weeks, I feel irrationally bleak. I've got zero levity, zero patience. I'm anxious, overwhelmed by simple tasks. I'm antisocial, oversensitive, on the brink of tears. For all these reasons, I feel like it can be characterized as a form of depression, which I think just backs up what Grace was saying. And, we do now have evidence that psilocybin helps with that. I found out about psychedelic therapy as a potential aid for menopause completely by chance. My paths crossed with a psilocybin researcher, and we were having a natter over breakfast one morning, and she told me there was gathering evidence that psilocybin helps with hormonal conditions like menopause. At this point, my ears pricked up. I was about 5 or 6 years into my menopause by then, and my main go-tos for maintaining my sanity were exercise and HRT, and they still are. But I definitely, by this stage, felt like I needed something extra, a bit more of a boost. So that's why I went to Beckley in May 2024. Before the retreat, there's a very thorough preparation program. You'll be asked to do lots of meditation, intention setting, journaling, visualization. If I'm really honest, these take up quite a bit of time. And I might have even felt a little bit resentful about that. But I now realize that the better prepared you are, you will get so much more out of the retreat. So I'm very glad I took that part of the process seriously. At the retreat itself, I was absolutely bowled over by the facilitators. They were just brimming with empathy and kindness and understanding. And obviously, you're arriving there feeling a bit anxious. That's an understatement. So that was invaluable. I was also really impressed by their range of skills. On our retreat, we had everything from a medical doctor through to a somatic therapist and everything in between. The ratio was also impressive. We had, I think it was 2 participants for each facilitator, and that really helped put me at ease. I met some brilliant like-minded women, one of whom's become a dear friend now. And be prepared to bare your soul to these strangers that you've only known for 5 days. You will come away from it with them knowing you more intimately than most other people in your life. And the bonus of that is that you get this amazing support group afterwards. My first ceremony was incredibly life affirming. It helped me heal with a really crucial but difficult relationship in my life. And by dealing with that more fundamental stuff, I feel like my brain width was freed up a bit to deal with the more current acute things like menopause. That's not to say there weren't difficulties. I really struggled to let go at the beginning of both of my ceremonies, and I hear that's very common. I also had some personal demons to face, but the payoff for that was that I eventually got this incredible momentary taste of nirvana and just this sudden realization that nothing had to be a problem, actually. And it was almost like this fundamental universal truth had been crystallized, and it was incredibly powerful. And I know it sounds a bit cheesy, but it felt incredibly real at the time, and it's stayed with me. I mean, I'm nearly 2 years after my retreat, so it's kind of buried deeper down now. But when things get difficult, I try to recall that moment, and it's actually very helpful. Most Beckley retreats do 2 ceremonies. For me, my second ceremony was probably less effective. I think I just got really lucky and got what I needed from the first one. But I know most of my fellow participants, they felt that the second one was more beneficial to them. When I came home, I felt untouchably calm and serene, which isn't like me. And I just had this beatific smile on my face, and I just couldn't help smiling at absolutely everyone. It was probably a bit nauseating for some people, actually. But having said that, I did also feel very delicate and slow for a good week afterwards. I guess that's the time when most of the neural rewiring is taking place. So it was a little bit discombobulating. But by week 2, I was sleeping really well. I'm a lifelong insomniac, so that was truly a gift. I felt more energized, and everything just felt blissfully problem-free. Weird things started happening. I started cycling faster than ever before. It was like I'd been supercharged by joy. It was very unexpected. In the same way that there's a very thorough preparatory program, there's also a very thorough post-retreat integration program. Again, thought I wouldn't need it. Again, definitely needed it. The exercises are there to help you reframe, this moment of incredible, it's an opportunity to reframe everything, which, when you're going through menopause, who doesn't need that opportunity? And it was really helpful in helping me process this incredible, but also slightly overwhelming experience. Plus, we had regular Zoom sessions with all the participants, and being with them again was incredibly valuable because they were the only people who really understood what I was going through. In terms of the legacy that it's left me with, well, for starters, healing that key relationship in my life has been an absolute game changer, and I feel like the benefits have filtered through to other parts of my life. It helped me believe in myself more. I think as women, we all have quite a strong vocal inner critic, and menopause will give that inner critic a microphone. But after the retreat, that inner critic like was a bit quieter, and it was amazing. Before I went on the retreat, I'd started writing a novel, which funnily enough ends at psilocybin retreat. And that process, it was fraught with self-doubt. But after the retreat, I got this huge boost of creativity and confidence and managed to finish my novel. So thank you, Beckley, for that. It's also helped me be more open. I mean, I am British, so therefore I am uptight. But I now understand that the more that I am prepared to be open with people, the more I will get back from people. It's also helped me trust myself more, and perhaps more importantly, trust other people more. So before the retreat, I just started a new relationship, which I wasn't 100% sure about. But since the retreat, that relationship has been blossoming. Um, I think that the neurological effects of that post-retreat glow, probably coming from the serotonin burst that Grace was talking about, that does taper off. I think I noticed that perhaps it was gradually fading at around the 6 month mark for me. I think it varies a lot amongst different people. But the one thing that will never taper off are the insights that I got from it. So the healing of that critical relationship, and that sort of fundamental truth that actually, you know what, chill out, nothing needs to be a problem. It was such an incredibly meaningful experience that I'm now considering doing another retreat. I can't expect to recreate my first experience, and it would be wrong to try and chase that. And I know that others in my group didn't get the sense of joy that I got. They more came away with a sense of peace within themselves and within the wider world. But you know what? Whether you get peace or you get joy, I mean, either way, those are brilliant antidotes to the menopause. So I can't recommend it enough.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you, Grace. I really appreciate you both sharing so much. And gosh, I mean, there's so many elements. I too have many questions to ask. I think one of the most common things that we hear with women that are coming in with menopause and perimenopause that there is hope for, that maybe Grace can touch on in our question and answers session, is just brain fog. It's like been quite prevalent recently, so it'd be interesting to chat about that. And but before we jump into question and answers, because we do have some great questions in the chat here, I just wanted to share some of the questions that we normally receive about Beckley retreats are normally related to legality and safety, and our facilitation team, as you can imagine, is pretty normal. So I'll just answer a couple of those or share a little bit about a couple of those. There is a slide presentation. I noticed that Leslie was having some trouble accessing, but we'll be sure to send that out and make sure everyone also has a copy of the presentation as well. But at Beckley Retreats, we only operate in locations where the use of psilocybin is legal. So currently in Jamaica and the Netherlands at, in my opinion, really incredible retreat centers. And safety is at the core of our model. And that really begins with the application process, as Helen was sharing, that we have a suitability screening where we're really looking to ensure that we can responsibly support each individual. And during the retreat, as Helen was sharing, we maintain publicly more of a 1 to 3 facilitator to participant ratio. Sometimes that ratio is a bit lower, as we always try to keep support as robust as possible throughout the program. And then we implement a really robust just safety protocols on the back end to just provide as safe as a container as we possibly can. And finally, our incredible facilitation team brings hundreds of years of combined experience in psychedelic work and in many other modalities. But really, I think you've probably heard this a good bit at the foundation of all of this. Our goal is just to provide as supportive as a container as possible. Um, so we really appreciate you guys attending and sharing, and we can jump into questions here. They're flowing in. This is great. So let me try to back up a little bit to the first one. I think this was from Linda. Was sharing, and Grace or Helen, whomever feels most resonant here. My sense is that the loss of estrogen reveals unprocessed little t and big T trauma, soul reckoning calling. Any reflections there, team?
Yeah, I mean, I often talk about this when we talk about things like the menstrual cycle and we talk about, the symptoms we get at the end of the menstrual cycle. And often I think it's just because the mask of estrogen of being able to cope with that kind of thing for the other 3 weeks of the month comes away. And I think there's definitely some truth to that within menopause. And I think there's definitely a point when we go through that stage where as you say, our tolerance for being able to mask a lot of the symptoms that we've been able to mask very easily up until that point goes away as we lose kind of estrogen and also things like progesterone, which is an anti-anxiety kind of substance within our brain. So yeah, I definitely think it could really be that. But also I think perhaps, from a more psychological point of view, when we go through menopause, we perhaps don't feel the need to hide things quite so much in terms of how we show up in the world and how we kind of hide different parts of ourselves.
And then when we're referring to the benefits of psychedelics, the question here is, are you referring only to psilocybin or others like ketamine, cannabis, and MDMA? And if psilocybin, are you referring to the research showing these benefits with macro or micro doses?
Yeah, wonderful question. So obviously, there's a lot of debate on what is the full definition of a psychedelic. I'm really talking when I've talked about the mechanisms here, mostly about classical psychedelics. So things like psilocybin, LSD, ayahuasca, things that really work through this 5-HT2A receptor. Now, things like ketamine and MDMA, for instance, do have these antidepressant effects and anti-anxiety effects. And when it comes to things like cannabis, well, I'm actually giving a webinar on that in a few weeks' time because the mechanism is entirely different there. So there is some potential for how cannabis could be helpful for menopause, but not really how I've been speaking here. But yeah, when we think about psychedelics and how it can be used, whether it should be large doses or micro doses, we still don't fully understand. The majority of the evidence that we have is for large doses. It's for people going and having large experiences with psychedelics. We really are at the infancy of understanding microdoses, and there is some theory that it could be very useful for menopause. And I'm running a little study looking at that at the moment, but in terms of empirical evidence for things like depression, anxiety, improving neuroplasticity, large doses is where we have the strongest evidence.
And the other question, it looks like from Karen that came in that rolls into this, with those large doses, how many journeys are needed for benefits?
Well, only one if it's done right. But that there is obviously, no limit to how many that you could do, but I think everyone should be done with respect and intention. And so, you should only really be doing as many as you have the time, like Helen said, to do that good prep and to do that good integration work. But one large ceremony should be enough to get meaningful benefit. But as we, we've ran in a number of different programs, and like Beckley does, doing two ceremonies offers people that opportunity when they've really taken that time to prepare and integrate, to have sort of two bites at the apple, as it were, in terms of getting through a lot of the psychological work that goes on during these ceremonies.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
for me, I got super lucky, and the first ceremony gave me everything I needed, and the second one was just cherry on top. But it wasn't the same for all my fellow participants.
Yeah, and Helen, I think what we also see at Beckley in the way that we sometimes will approach our ceremonies is, especially for people who may not have experienced psychedelics in this way before, is that first ceremony can really offer the opportunity to get your bearings about you in this new, experience. And then often that second ceremony is another opportunity to go a little bit deeper. So we often encourage people to approach it in that way. Um, let's see. Josefina has a question here. There's big buzz about ibogaine down here in Texas research circles. Any thoughts on ibogaine?
Yeah, again, ibogaine is showing a huge amount of potential, but ibogaine also has, larger psychological effects in some regard, but also larger physiological response in some regard. And so, what I mean by that is we know, for instance, it puts a higher risk on your cardiovascular system than some other psychedelics. Now, that might be important when we're thinking about women and women in menopause because we know that cardiovascular risks go up during that time, for instance. It's also not a very, talking from how does it feel, ibogaine and iboga are kind of much more serious psychedelics in some regard. And although there is excellent evidence for their use for things like depression, anxiety, and addictions, we perhaps when thinking about what would be the right first psychedelic for somebody to use, I probably wouldn't recommend ibogaine and iboga, just because I think that you need to think about what the experience is going to be like, and these really are kind of the big boys of psychedelics. And again, they are much newer to science, psychedelic science, than things like psilocybin, where we have an awful lot of evidence that is extremely safe. Whereas we're still really learning with ibogaine and iboga what the real mechanisms are and exactly what the parameters are within the safety of its use.
Gosh, you guys, I'm loving all of these questions. So I'm just going to go in order because they're all quite wonderful. Nicole, does brain fog completely dissipate when one starts on HRT or psychedelics?
Well, it kind of depends exactly what's causing your brain fog. It can be caused by a number of things. It can be caused by things like the loss of estrogen and the effects on the brain there, but also by chronic stress, by heightened levels of cortisol, for instance. Our brain is then primed to only deal with the most important things, and we're not able to think as creatively during those times. And also sleep. Sleep deprivation has a huge effect on our bodies and our brains. And so it depends kind of what combination is being caused by this, and also how well you respond to HRT. HRT works quite differently for different women, and often different doses are needed, and it can take a while to kind of titrate yourself onto exactly what's needed. But it should, in theory, help with brain fog. And like you say, with psychedelics as well, they should also have a large impact. But it depends, are you then able to improve your sleep and improve your stress? Those things we can't really predict, but we do have good evidence that they are more likely if you engage in taking things like HRT or doing psychedelics.
Thank you, Grace. Jen is curious about the next women's retreat at Beckley. We definitely have some ideas in the work, so please stay tuned via our newsletter. We'll be sure to share information after that. And then the next question here, LaShonda is asking, can you address PCOS, hyperpigmentation, facial hair, hair thinning, and weight gain?
Yeah, I would recommend if you're having symptoms like that, that potentially you need to see someone about getting things like your thyroid checked, because there could be something else going on there that is often associated with change in hormones, but particularly where we think about things like huge changes in things like facial hair and weight gain and losing your hair, then it can often be associated with our thyroid as well. For PCOS, there is some interesting kind of research that's starting to go on about psychedelics and how they could be helpful with PCOS. But we're not really quite there yet in terms of understanding the mechanism of how it can be. We've just seen people start to explain that or tell us that they've seen changes, positive changes in their symptoms, but it's still yet to be understood. But we're working very hard to try and research it as fast as we can.
So I imagine that that same advice probably applies to Deborah's question around hair loss and will it return, energy levels, insomnia, elements like that, Grace.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously it depends on the levels of which you're seeing those symptoms. And there is a huge change in weight gain and just body composition that goes on through menopause. These these hormones affect kind of all tissues within our bodies, and so there's an awful lot out there. And I really, recommend. We are so lucky now. We have access to such incredible data of people really starting to understand what women need. And it's not always going on a crash diet. It's usually eating a lot more protein and things like that, and doing things like weightlifting that help with stuff like our body composition as we move into menopause.
Well, I'm just going to pause for a moment and just thank everyone who might need to pop now because we are at time, but we'll stay on for a few more minutes to try to get through the remainder of these questions. But thank you all so much for attending, and we're really looking forward to continuing this conversation and sharing more information on navigating menopause. So as we jump in here, it looks like another question from Linda. What is your recommendation for someone who toughed it out through menopause but is still experiencing the physical and emotional effects of postmenopause?
Yeah, well, I guess, well done you. And we really shouldn't have to tough it out. We really should have better medical systems that, actually recognize these symptoms as real and give us good options as to how to treat them. But it may be that some women only have experienced symptoms during perimenopause, but other people continue to experience those symptoms during menopause. So I think recognizing them is the first part, and then looking at what your options are in terms of getting help. HRT is, best if started earlier, but it still could be very useful for people in the later stages of perimenopause and menopause. But often it's not the right thing, particularly if you've been without hormones for some time. To reintroduce them can be, in some women, destabilizing. So perhaps looking at what other techniques and treatments that you could look for in order to manage the particular symptoms that you're having. And, maybe that is coming and doing a psilocybin retreat, who knows?
Grace, there's a request for the link for your cannabis talk, so please share that with us so we can share that out as an additional resource um, post. And any research on MDMA and menopause depression?
Yeah, so I mean, there's been a lot of research that's been going on with MDMA for things like post-traumatic stress disorder, but I'm not aware of anything specifically that has been used for menopause and treating it using MDMA. We do, as I say, know that it seems to be quite good as a kind of assisting therapy to things like psychedelic assisted therapies, which are much more kind of talking experiences where you might sit one-on-one with a therapist and go through specific things that have happened. And it can be extremely useful in helping people process that. But it is kind of quite different from what we see when we use psilocybin, which is less about you talking one-on-one in a therapeutic way with a single person. And it's much more about an internal conversation, I think, is how it probably is best described. And being well supported through an excellent facilitation team to have that conversation while you're under psilocybin.
Talia is curious, is it safe to take psychedelics when on bioidentical hormone replacement therapy?
Yeah, I mean, as far as we can see, it seems to be quite safe. There are a number of women now who've gone through a lot of retreats similar to Beckley, and others who have been on HRT. I think it's really important that you have that discussion and disclose whatever medications you're on when you go through these programs. But as far as we're aware, there doesn't seem to be any interactions between things like psilocybin and HRT.
And Sarah shared that I've been macrodosing and I've had an increase in headaches and worse sleep, but I'm also integrating slash processing big T trauma following a macrodose.
Yeah, and that's quite possible. And I don't know if Helen wants to say something to this, but when we go through these experiences, like we say, we can often uncover things that might take us some time to sit and process. In terms of it kind of disturbing your sleep, I'm sorry to hear that. But yeah, if you're identifying it as perhaps being to do with what you realize during that, then that is potentially contributing to insomnia through anxiety pathways.
Yeah, I think it probably depends how long you've been doing it for as well, right? They're definitely, I mean, like I said, the the week immediately after my retreat, I was processing so much that my sleep got even worse, and I thought, oh my God, I've made it worse. But it just, once I'd managed to do most of the heavy lifting, after that I was sleeping much better, and that's when the brain fog lifted. Like Grace said, we don't know why. Maybe it's because I was sleeping better, or maybe it's because the burst of serotonin. But yeah, I think you just need to maybe give it a while, but then who knows how long you've been doing it for.
Yeah, that new kind of greater awareness is it's a lot to process. And I think that's why integration is such an important part of these experiences. Um, let's see. Catherine's curious if there's a way to participate in studies in London. She's very interested, Grace, so we'll be sure to check in on that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Linda has found that the microdosing is helping as much as macro sessions. That's quite interesting. And I think, let's see. Um, okay, how can employers support employees that are going through menopause? I recently lost my job due to mood swings, not able to control facial expressions. That's a big question. That's
Yeah,
big systemic pieces there that certainly we hope to provide. I think some of these research elements will and things that are happening now will help support, we hope, more growth and supportive pieces for employees to take on. Let's see. Are there other, I'm going to probably close out questions in just a minute here. I think we've got about two more. Are there resources for medical practitioners who are interested in better understanding protocols and creating, uh-oh, it's jumping around here, and creating access for patients?
In terms of for psychedelics and menopause, I mean, we're definitely seeing a lot more educational programs that are coming up. I know at Hysterica we're running an educational program to try and understand the female brain and psychedelics. But in terms of good clinical practice where we can find out, I'm not sure what it is like in the USA, but we are certainly seeing a huge change. I mean, there was a huge change with the FDA and how we're prescribing HRT and what the advice is that came just at the end of last year. So I think the next few years are going to see a big wave of new treatments for menopause, hopefully, and with that, good clinical advice.
Well, thank you, Grace, and thank you, Helen. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Julie, you can absolutely share this with a friend, and we will have another webinar shortly, so please feel free to share that link. But wonderful to have this conversation with you all, and we look forward to continuing the conversation down the road. So thank you, Grace and Helen. It was wonderful to see you both.
sure.
Great to
Thank you
see
very
you.
much for having me.
Yeah, bye
Bye.
bye.